Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Test Scores Optional, What It Means for Access to Higher Education, sponsored by the McCoy Family Center for Ethics in Society at Stanford University. I hope wherever you're joining us from tonight, you're staying safe and well, and I want to thank you for making the time to thank you for making the time to join us tonight. My name is Sonia Giebel. I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate at Stanford's Graduate School of Education. I study higher education admissions and diversity, and I'm also a former admissions counselor. Given my own scholarly interests and my professional experience in this area, I'm especially excited to introduce our speakers tonight and to provide some motivation for tonight's discussion. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought many changes to our lives, including bringing the test optional movement to a watershed moment. Colleges and universities have rapidly dropped standardized testing requirements. And while standardized tests like the SAT and the ACT have long been controversial, the move to test optional represents a really fundamental shift in selective admissions with important implications for our applicants and for higher education practitioners as well. How will applications be reviewed in the absence of test scores? And what are the implications for questions of equity, social mobility, and diversity? Tonight's discussion will have the following format. Each speaker will have 5 minutes to provide a brief presentation, which will be followed by 20 minutes of moderated discussion, and then we'll close with 20 minutes of audience question and answer. Please submit any questions you may have throughout the event. You do not need to wait until that last question and answer portion through the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'll now introduce our panel of experts who will help us think through this important topic. First, we have Dr. Angel Pérez, who is the CEO of the National Association of College Admission Counseling, or NACAC. This represents nearly 14,000 admission and counseling professionals worldwide. He is a national thought leader on issues of educational equity, access, and success in American education, and previously served for 22 years in higher education leadership. His success as Vice President of Enrollment at Trinity College in Connecticut was recently spotlighted in Paul Tufts' book, The Years That Matter Most, and his many accomplishments have also been recognized by outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, and others. Professor Sarah Turner is University Professor of Economics and Education and the Souter Family Endowed Chair at the University of Virginia. Professor Turner's research focuses on the supply and demand sides of the education market, as well as the link to the labor market and how public policies affect educational outcomes. Her recent scholarship has focused on how high school seniors and their parents perceive the cost of different higher education options, their likelihood of admission, knowledge of financial aid, and sources of information in the college application process. Professor Jesse Rothstein is Professor of Public Policy and Economics at the University of California, Berkeley, and co-director of the California Public Policy Lab. He previously served as chief economist at the U.S. Department of Labor and a senior economist with the Council of Economic Advisors, Executive Office of the President, both in the Obama administration. From 2015 to 2020, he directed the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment at UC Berkeley. Professor Rothstein's research focuses on education policy and on the labor market, including studies of teacher quality, school finance, and intergenerational economic mobility. Anna McCullough is the co-founder and CEO of QuestBridge, a national nonprofit that connects high-achieving, low-income students to 45 of the nation's leading colleges and universities on full or near full rides. She founded QuestBridge during her undergraduate years at Stanford and continued to grow QuestBridge during her time as a law student, also at Stanford. She's a regular speaker to university, nonprofit, and corporate audiences about access to higher education, diversity and inclusion, innovation, and nonprofit management and strategy. Finally, Professor Anthony Lising Antonio will serve as moderator of this event. Professor Antonio is Associate Professor of Education at Stanford's Graduate School of Education. His research focuses on equity issues in American higher education and considers how college-going cultures are developed and maintained in schools, especially as undergraduate admissions become more competitive. He is also one of the faculty co-leads of the Student Narrative Lab, which analyzes a large corpus of undergraduate applications to better understand conceptions of American meritocracy in education. I will pass things over to Dr. Pérez in just one moment, but I first want to extend special thanks to AJ Alvaro, my friend and colleague, and to the McCoy Center's research director, Ann Newman, who were wonderful thought partners in the crafting of this event. I also want to thank the administrative team who made this event possible, as well as to the Ethics Center's executive director, Joan Berry. And thank you all for joining us tonight. With that, I will let Dr. Pérez kick us off.
Great, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. I thought I would start by sort of admitting that I come to this panel with sort of several different biases, and one of them is that I have been a practitioner who really has advocated for test optional policies for over 22 years on various campuses throughout the country, and really have seen the deep impact that it has had on communities, and the ways that it has opened doors for particularly first generation low income students and students of color. But also, I was also someone who has advocated for these policies because of my own story as a first generation student who attended a massive public high school in New York City and saw how basically not having the right preparation for the exam did not really prepare me to get good scores on those exams. And so, I have really spent a lot of my career advocating for test optional policies. And as we know, and the reason we're here today is because during COVID, the test optional policies actually have been expanded. Some schools have actually gone test blind, but also at this point, over 1,700 institutions, and maybe more now, have really gone test optional. But what I will say is that COVID really has accelerated a movement that was already well underway. Prior to COVID, there were already hundreds of institutions that had gone test optional, including some of the most selective colleges and universities in the country, for example, like the University of Chicago. And so I really see COVID as accelerating something that was well underway. We already had pre-COVID a lot of research studies that showed, for example, that test optional policies can lead to more diverse institutions and can certainly lead to having more diverse applicant pools in admission offices. We also knew that there was a direct correlation between the SAT, for example, and wealth. And so that wealthier students tended to score higher on exams, and that students of color and low income students were disproportionately disadvantaged in this particular process. And the other thing that I think is really interesting to note, so I'm at the National Association for College Admissions Counseling, and we run a state of college admissions report every year. And one of the things that we have seen in our surveys to college admission officers is that every year, more admission officers say that the SAT and the ACT has less influence on their decision-making in applications. And so again, this was already really underway, but the pandemic has really led the movement to move just a little bit faster. Now, one of the things that I think is important for me to share and a perspective that I want to bring here is the perspective of the student, because I know that my colleagues will talk a lot about research, and particularly my faculty colleagues who are doing a lot of research in this work, but I have just seen how this impacts student lives directly. I also have been at institutions where students have basically told me that as a result of the institution going test optional, that those students decided to apply. I will still remember being in New York City when I met this young Latinx woman who had applied. At the time, I was vice president for enrollment and student success at Trinity College in Connecticut. And she really wowed me during one of our receptions. And she told me that she decided to apply to the institution after we went test optional because her counselor had told her that her average SAT scores really didn't match our history. When I went back to my office the next day and I looked at that young woman's file, I just couldn't believe that we would have missed out on someone so extraordinary who had done so well in high school, who was such a good fit for the institution, who would bring so many different new perspectives to the institution, and we would have missed out on her if we had required the exam. And I honestly have hundreds of stories like this throughout my career. And so one of the reasons why I really have advocated for this policy. But also, as I have worked individually with families, both on the high school and the secondary side, the cost that this brings to families, not just financial costs, but also the extraordinary burden, especially now during COVID, where families are not 100% sure whether they should send their children to actually be tested during COVID. I have lots of friends in California who have asked me if they should drive with their friends and with their students rather to Utah to get themselves the exam. And I have unequivocally said, no, they should not do that. And so, these policies, we have to remember that while we can continue to do research studies and see how they impact student success, the reality is that we are talking about young people's lives. And these policies have shown that if you make the exam optional, that you will see more students who not only will enter your applicant pools, but also could see themselves enrolling at the institution. So there's two other points that I'm going to end with, but that I hope that we will discuss on the panel. One is that I really think that institutions need to grapple with whether or not the cost, financially, emotionally, and otherwise, to students and families and counselors, frankly, is really worth what colleges actually gain from requiring the exam. And I mentioned counselors because counselors are the ones who are administering the exams in the schools, and it is an extraordinary cost of time, for example, to them. And so one of the things that I think colleges and universities need to really grapple with is all of that worth, the information that is gained during the admissions process. And then the last thing I'll mention is that something that I've learned throughout my career is that it's really important that institutions understand that going test optional is not automatically going to diversify your institution. So the institutions that have been really successful in this space have implemented new and different recruitment policies, have expanded financial aid resources, have really invested in retention, onboarding, orientation programming, as well as student success resources. And so as institutions are talking about going test optional and implementing those policies, it's also incredibly important that they are putting together other kinds of resources that they are going to be able to give to students once they arrive in order to ensure their success. So with that, I am going to turn it over to my colleague.
Thank you, Angel. So much to learn from Angel and the other people on this panel. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here, and we thank Joan and others for pulling this group together. Let me hit start on a timer so I don't overspeak here. But I want to start from a little bit of a different position as a researcher and somebody who's looking at data. And from my vantage point right now, I think where my thesis for my 5 minutes is that really the impact of test optional, certainly in the COVID environment and definitely beyond, is an open question. We also control some of those answers, and I hope that through the process of collecting and sharing data and evaluating what we're doing, we're going to end up with a dramatically transformed and improved mechanism for admission. I think that this basic issue that is driving everyone in this conversation about the underrepresentation of low-income, first-gen, minority students in both application and also matriculation at the selective colleges and universities really is important and is certainly limiting mobility and opportunity for students. That said, I'm trained as an economist, and part of my job is, I think, to think really carefully about unintended consequences here. And that's where I'm going to focus some of my comments this evening, even as I want to emphasize just from the outset that I would not claim this. I think that there are enormous flaws in the, if you will, the status quo, either now or pre-COVID, in the use of admissions testing in practices across colleges and universities. But I do want to come back to thinking about standardized assessments and some of the benefits in general. But I think how I got to this topic was just in thinking about some of the claims that were being made this summer as we shifted from, I think, 4 of the top 50 institutions as being test optional to nearly all of them by the middle of summer, eliminating tests as a requirement from the admissions process. And I thought that claims that this would necessarily narrow gaps in opportunity were worth re-examining. And I wrote a short piece under the heading "Test Optional Admissions Might," and I want to underscore might, widen differences in opportunity. And I was really actually quite surprised at some of the responses, and a few of them were actually quite mean-spirited from actually representatives of universities. So I'm hoping that we can think actually thoughtfully in this forum just about what the evidence shows. And I think my sort of starting point, the bottom bullet here, is this idea that test optional pre-COVID, when only a few institutions were using the policy, is not the same. It's going to have sort of different implications than when it is an across-the-board policy. And there are other things going on in terms of the COVID environment that may not be good predictors of how test optional will work in a post-COVID environment. And I think there's some real deficiencies in the COVID process that are exacerbating what is a very difficult situation to begin with. So let me make that point. I think Jesse may come back to some of this, but what do we know? This is a starting point. And I guess I'm going to come back to, again, how little we can actually conclude from the descriptive information that is now in the marketplace. We know right now that applications are way up at selective college as in universities in both the private sector and the public sector. So institutions like Stanford, institutions like UVA are way up in admissions. But there are at least two explanations for this. One is that the same students that always applied, facing uncertainty in how institutions are going to act, have just simply submitted many more applications than in prior years. This is sort of like buying more lottery tickets. A second explanation, and a more hopeful explanation, is that the test optional policy has encouraged students who were otherwise discouraged or felt this chilling effect of their perceptions of how the scores would be perceived by universities are now submitting applications. And again, it's the question we don't know the answer to right now. And we want to know both what the demographic composition is of both groups. We're going to have to wait to get some of those data. And then we do have some chilling information in terms of just our suspicions about what is going on in those communities, those high schools that have been most affected by COVID. We do know, sort of pressing the other direction, that FAFSA applications are down, particularly at Title I schools, also among students or high schools with a disproportionate number of students from color. So again, a caution in terms of what we can conclude from the information that is out there right now in terms of growing numbers of applications. So what are the underlying sort of, I guess, reasons to be concerned that test optional may not open opportunities for those students who've traditionally been limited in opportunities at selective colleges and universities? I've got three, and I will try and go through them very quickly. First, it is the high income, high resources families that are most able to navigate the strategy of to submit tests to not submit tests. I've got a nice slide on this. Again, these are the families that are flying to places so that they can get a test. They are going out of town to gain access to testing. Second, we might be concerned that absent tests, we're just going to shift the burden of competitive strategic behavior to other instruments, whether they be essays, recs, or potentially grades in the long run. And finally, a point to keep in mind is that there's likely to be more, if you will, high GPA, low test score students from fairly affluent households than there are from low-income households or minority families. And I can show you data on this when we conclude, but I have a suspicion that I am out of time. So let me cut to the well, we'll come back to this in discussion. I think this is an open question. We want to use the opportunity now to experiment, to collect data, to learn about how to implement better policies in the post-COVID era. Okay, that is done. Let me turn things over to my colleague, Jesse Rothstein, if I can figure out how to do this.
Great. Well, thank you all very much. And thank you, Sarah. I am going to talk, I'm going to focus on the question of what does test optional look like after we're through COVID? I think there's a bunch of interesting questions about what do we do this year and next year because of COVID, but I think the policy that I think is most interesting is should we stick with that test optional after COVID is over? I'm going to try to talk about three separate questions that I think are helpful for thinking about this. The first is whether the SAT or the ACT are fair to use and to require in admissions. Next, if you think the answer is no, which I do, does test optional fix the problem? And then the third is what can we learn from the COVID experience? So let me start with the first question, which is whether SAT or ACT are fair. I think the evidence is very clear here that they're not. The scores are very strongly correlated with family background. Students from more advantaged backgrounds do better on the tests. And even more so than could be justified by pointing to the fact that family background is also correlated with college preparedness. Even though the SAT is supposed to be measuring preparedness, in fact, it does a better job of measuring background than it does of measuring differences in preparedness among students who have similar backgrounds. We know that students from advantaged backgrounds transition more easily to college, and the SAT basically gets credit for measuring that somebody is in that group. It amounts to giving preferences to students from wealthy white high schools that nobody would be able to defend if it were clear that that's what we were doing. But because it's labeled as a test score, it seems more fair. In fact, it isn't. Now, there's always, when you say this, people always say, well, all the other admissions measures are less fair. And I just don't think the evidence supports that. The primary alternative measure is the GPA, and GPAs do seem to be more fair. They seem to be more comparable across students from different backgrounds. And while it's in theory possible that grade inflation could make them less useful, we just don't see evidence that that's a huge problem in practice. So my conclusion is that the SAT is really a force increasing unfairness in the system. Okay, so then the next question is, given that, does test optional help fix the problem? And here again, I think the answer is no. If we believe that advantaged students get an unfair boost in their test scores relative to what we think would be appropriate to use in admissions, a kind of fair measure of preparedness. So let's imagine that's true. Students who get high SAT scores will submit them under test optional, and they won't submit them if they don't get high test scores. So if we are making this admissions decisions at the margin, we're going to have students who are pretty similarly prepared, one of whom submits a high SAT score, and one of them doesn't submit an SAT score at all. Clearly, we're going to choose the one who has a high SAT score to the one who doesn't submit a score. But if students from advantaged backgrounds have an easier time getting that high SAT score that allows them to submit it, that means that the advantage they have in the SAT is preserved under a test optional system. Now, that unfairness is compounded by the fact that advantaged students are already more likely to have access to counselors and advisors who can help them figure out what the right strategy is, who can help them figure out whether they should or shouldn't submit the SAT. They're also less likely to be dissuaded from taking the test or from retaking the test by cost. But even if you manage to get everybody access to equal access to counseling and equal access to test taking and test prep, you'd still have this fact that the test seems to advantage already advantaged students, and test optional doesn't get rid of that. The only exception would be that if when the college is confronted with two equally qualified students, one of them has a high SAT score and one of them doesn't have an SAT score, if it commits to ignoring the test score, but then you're not really in a test optional world, then you're in a test blind world. And I think that's the only way to make tests fair is to not use them. Last, let me talk about what I think we should learn from COVID. And I think mostly the answer is very little. Everything about admissions this year and next year are going to be totally unlike any other year. Students who applied for college this past fall, they spent the spring of their junior years and the fall or even all of their senior years in so-called remote learning. If they have grades at all from the spring semester, they're meaningless, or at least mean something very different than what an ordinary junior year spring grades would mean. And that's, of course, the key measure that we use in most admissions. Extracurricular activities were disrupted. They had much less access to their counselors, but they maybe had lots of free time to fill out applications. So I think we're not going to know. It's very hard. It's impossible to disentangle all the different factors that lead to changes in applications this year of admissions. And we know that admissions are going to be a mess because there are really none of the measures that are available that aren't disrupted by COVID. I think we should be prepared that next year's first year students will be significantly less prepared for college than usual. And that's not because of the admissions process. It's just because high school seniors are less prepared this year than they will be than in other years. It's nothing to do with test optional. So the one thing I think we can take from this is we can learn a little bit by doing. There was always going to be a rough transition if you moved from requiring tests to test optional, that we have to figure out new ways of reading and evaluating files, how to evaluate a student's strength without relying on the test scores as a crutch. That was going to be a learning experience, and the first year of doing that was always going to be rough. We've been forced to do that this year. And I think admissions officers are learning a lot about how to evaluate the files without looking at the test scores. And they should be able to take that learning into next year, and hopefully will make it easier to transition to future admissions regimes that rely less on the test. And with that, let me pass it over to Anna.
Hi there, I'm Anna McCullough. I am the co-founder and CEO of QuestBridge. As some of you may know, QuestBridge is a national nonprofit organization that really supports and was founded originally to serve the students that we're talking about right now, the ones that have been traditionally underrepresented and underserved by the college admissions process. So I am one of the co-founders of QuestBridge, and also have been doing this since the mid-90s when QuestBridge was founded. So I have a few slides to share, but they're not, they're mostly just images and pictures, because after all, we're here for the students. So let me share that right now. So QuestBridge, just a real brief background, because I know that some of you may not be familiar with the organization. As I said, we're a nonprofit organization. We serve high achieving students from low income backgrounds, and we partner currently with 45 of the nation's selective universities and colleges. You can see these are some of our students who are represented. They're wearing their t-shirts, so you can see some of the schools that we work with. But this is just a small number of the students that we serve. We actually have 9,000 undergraduates currently going through college right now through QuestBridge, as well as 10,000 alums. But we started actually as a very small program actually at Stanford University, and it was there that we really started to see the impact of standardized testing, or actually the relationship between standardized testing and these really compelling and diverse candidates. So what we saw, and what some of the other panelists have referenced today, is a couple of things around standardized testing and this particular population. The first one was that we actually lived in a dorm with these students. And so we offered things like test prep and essay writing training and so forth. This was in the early days, in the mid-90s. And we saw the test scores go up dramatically when we offer tutoring, which makes sense. And that's what we all know. And we all know that, of course, most of the time, students from these backgrounds don't actually have access to such tutoring. And the tutoring wasn't even that much. It was maybe like once or twice a week. And we'd see scores go up 200 points, 400 points. And so in the process of observing that, we thought, wow, great for these students, but there must be so many more who, thousands more, who just have the capacity to be successful at these great schools, but who just are not getting the training to take this test. The other side of that, of the testing that we saw kind of right up close and personal, was the fact that a number of our students did have what you might consider less competitive scores, but then as a result of being sort of through a program like ours, and that we could help them to sort of contextualize their life history in the process of applying to college, they were accepted even with these quote unquote less competitive scores, and they would often do extremely well at some of the best universities in the country and colleges. And so what we saw was that the test score itself, at least in practice, didn't seem to be an accurate measure of whether the students were prepared or capable of thriving at the best colleges in the country. So here's a little bit more. And here, this is the students again today. Like I said, we have 9,000 students, and our current undergraduates. And just to give you some background on the process, what happens is our students apply to our flagship program called the National College Match. And this program we have an application that's offered for free, and the students apply, and they go through an initial screen that QuestBridge does to select QuestBridge finalists. And those students go on to our colleges, and our colleges end up selecting the students. If they get in the early round, which we call the match round, they actually get a full 4-year scholarship with no loans, no parental contribution, and the colleges offer these generous scholarships to them. If they don't get in the match round, then they can actually apply regular decision or early decision, and they often get an equivalent or very, very strong financial aid package. You do not have to have test scores to apply to QuestBridge, and you never have. From the very beginning, it was always something that you could apply to and become a finalist without a test score. But what's relevant and interesting this year, and of course we know this is an unusual year because of COVID, but the fact is that we had about 50% of our applicants for the National College Match this year, which just happened in the fall, did not have testing. Though this year was our most successful year actually ever in terms of placing students into our 45, or actually at the time 42 schools. And that was over 1,450 students actually got in through that process. And like I said, we've seen this over and over again that students from these backgrounds, the testing, when they take the test, they're not always an accurate measure of their readiness, their preparedness. And so our thought at QuestBridge is that standardized testing is one piece of a larger systemic type of, I think, we created QuestBridge in order to address the fact that across the board in many domains, on many dimensions, these students are disadvantaged in the process. Testing is one piece of it. And we believe that if an assessment is to be useful for students like this, that it needs to somehow capture a little bit more of the context of what they're experiencing. So what they have contextualized their life and their histories, and also to also be searching and looking for qualities that go beyond what the current standardized tests measure, and really look for other qualities that can be more correlated with success in college and in life for that matter. So anyway, that's our thought here. I'm really excited to be here with these panelists and to be able to discuss this with all of you. And with that, I will pass it on to Anthony.
Thank you, Anna. And thank you, Sonia, for the introductions, and all the panelists for kicking us off here. I'd invite all the panelists now to turn on their cameras so we can be a virtual panel for the audience. And I have a set of questions, and I might direct them toward one of you in particular, but I'd like this to be a free-flowing conversation, and so feel free to jump in, interject, add what you would like to add, and we'll just roll with it. I hope that's fine. So again, I really appreciate all of your perspectives. It helps us kick off this conversation. I kind of want to start, go back to basics a tiny bit as we think about test optional. And where I'd like to start is with the test itself. And mostly what we've been talking about is the SAT, but we could talk about other tests as well. And if we're talking about test optional, the first question that might come to mind is, what are we giving up, right? If we are an admission office, or if we're advising students, what are we giving up in a test? And so that might be phrased another way, which is, what does an admission test tell us, right, about applicants' worthiness? We have some indication that it's correlated with SES and income and those kinds of things, but what does it really tell us? What information is in there? And we can respond from our different experiences working with students, conducting research, creating interventions. And I want to start with you, Anna. You made that comment about what most folks know about, the ability to, some people say, coach SAT performance up. Maybe with that experience, what can you tell us from your perspective about what the SAT tells us about college readiness? And if we're losing it, what are we giving up?
Sorry, Anthony, were you asking me that?
Yes.
Okay, so yes, thank you. It seems to me that standardized tests are intended to measure perhaps a candidate's readiness for the rigor of a college curriculum. And I think that perhaps, what we've seen is that it at the moment seems to measure a high score, seems to maybe be correlated with that, but maybe even more so correlated with the level of preparedness the student had with the test itself. So in other words, the coaching, the tutoring, potentially, and I would say also not just the formal tutoring, but really the whole systemic preparation that students from from more privileged backgrounds and resourced backgrounds have, everything from the kind of conversation that they're having in casual kind of settings with their families, or the fact that in their schools there's just a built-in sort of assumption about readiness and curriculum preparedness. I think we've seen in our students that we can't take for granted that they're going to be ready for those things based on the experiences they've had in life. And their experiences in life have been in many ways so compelling and so inspiring, especially given what they have experienced and how they perform on tests and in school. But the point is that it seems like the test at the moment seems to measure at certainly whether or not you've had coaching and been prepared. I think that what you would give up by not using those tests is, from the research I've read, which my colleagues have much more experience with, it seems to me that you can potentially have, without the test, the ability to look at the other aspects of the application, to compare students against each other when you're trying to, for example, populate a limited number of seats in a class. But it seems to me our position is not that all assessments are negative or bad. We just believe that the assessment should be looking at additional factors, not just the ones that they're currently looking at.
Mm-hmm. Jesse, I know you've done work on the SAT and its predictive value for things like freshman grades, but you also told us pretty emphatically that it's not a fair test, given how correlated it is with income, et cetera. But perhaps it does provide some information about worthiness. What do you think it tells us about an applicant?
Right. I mean, the challenge that we have is that preparedness, the ability to transition smoothly into college, is itself correlated with family background. And so students from more advantaged backgrounds are going to transition more easily. And anything that measures that family background is going to be predictive of how well a student does in their first year of college. Right? If we just told people and asked, have you played lacrosse before? That's going to be pretty well predictive of how well somebody will do in their first year. Not because lacrosse skills are super useful in freshman year, but because it's a good indication that you came from a pretty advantaged background. That the SAT, it turns out, isn't completely like that, but it plays that role to some extent. It looks like it's a very strong predictor, but it's in part a strong predictor because it's so strongly correlated with family background. I think we should be looking for measures that are not functioning as proxies for student advantage, but are capturing differences in preparedness among students of similar advantage. And if we had two students who were equally prepared, I think we probably ought to give a leg up to the student who comes from a more disadvantaged background. Even though, we can debate how big that leg up should be, but I think they overcame more to get there. And even though they may be predicted to do just as well in their first year, I think there's reason to expect they'll do better later on. The SAT does the opposite of that.
Mm-hmm. And Sarah, I know you've done work on an intervention for high achieving, low income students, and use test scores to identify those students. So from that perspective, what value is the SAT in identifying that talent?
So again, I think Oops, I think I'm stuck here on my video. Sorry about that.
You're good.
So first, I agree so much with what Anna said and what Jesse said in terms of objectives of testing, in terms of wanting multiple measures of talent, and also the current process around the SAT, the fact that there's differential access to studying, which has a big impact on performance. But if one backs away from what I would call a flawed current SAT, or you can substitute ACT, in administration right now, there are advantages to standardized assessments for students in terms of understanding how good they really may be. Again, I think that one of the advantages of using the instrument that we had, which was the SAT, in the Expanding College Opportunities Project, Sue Denarski has used something similar with both the SAT and the ACT in Michigan to identify students, is the capacity to reach out to students, to identify students, to let them know that that they have the capacity, that they have indications that they really can access institutions in a national market, and that those institutions may actually turn out to be more affordable than local institutions. Now, I think at the heart of your question, so you get these advantages with right now of identification for, I think the Hispanic Scholarship Program has proven very successful in that way. Identification of students. Students are also able to understand how they fit on a standardized scale. But at issue is whether there are other ways to do that without all of the adverse inequality producing impacts of the current testing regime. So again, are there other metrics that we could use, or again, you think about the search list that colleges are using to contact students, that is actually facilitated by this testing process. And again, I certainly wouldn't claim that outweighs some of the costs, but if you can think about other ways to use either state assessments or other matching mechanisms to help the market of colleges connect with students, I think you could substitute and gain.
Mm-hmm. I think that the question of other kinds of indicators is one of the first things that comes up when we talk about test optional. And for me, it goes back to, again, another basic question, which is, what is college readiness? We often talk about college readiness in sort of very vague ways. We might try to measure it by correlating something with freshman grades or graduation rates or something like that. But I haven't heard many talk very specifically about what is college readiness. And I'd like to turn to Angel, in part because you have a lot of experience with test optional colleges, personally and through NACAC. And so I imagine that question has been thought about very deeply. What is college readiness? And how do we assess that in a test optional world?
Yeah, and by the way, can you hear me well? Just thumbs up. Okay.
It sounds great, yeah.
I didn't realize that my microphone was a little covered, so I apologize if you didn't hear what I had to say earlier, but that is a question that has come up. And, I sort of want to string your current question with some of the thoughts I had about the previous question. One of my challenges, around this notion of test optional is the argument, and I heard this particularly from my faculty colleagues on highly selective college campuses, who were in opposition of test optional movements, that the test was something that could be used to level the playing field, to really standardize a process. And the reality of the matter is, until we fix our educational system in this country, we are not leveling the playing field during the admissions process. And so part of the reason I'm so passionate about this particular movement is we need to use different kinds of instruments and see what kind of skill sets students already bring to the table, not just GPA, and maybe other kinds of assessments like AP scores or IB scores or college prep courses, but other kinds of characteristics, activities that really predict success in college as well. My challenge with your question, Anthony, is the reality of the matter is, college success is defined differently, and being ready for college is defined differently depending on the institution that you sit at. Stanford probably defines it differently than UVA, and it might define it differently than your local community college. And so that's another challenge, that we are really trying to standardize what college readiness means. And depending on the kind of institution that you're at, the kind of support systems and onboarding and first-year experience programs that and academic programs that are offered, that could look really different. But what I will say about how assessment happens in a test optional environment, what I always found really interesting is that when I moved to institutions and I helped those institutions become test optional, the biggest question the faculty would ask, or my own admissions officers would ask me, is, well, what are we going to use instead? And my answer was, nothing. We already have everything we need to make the decision in order to figure out whether or not at this particular institution, this student is ready for the rigor, the coursework, and whether or not the student is a fit. I would say, high school GPA and the kind of curriculum that the student was taking was very high up on the list in terms of what we looked at, any other assessments that came with that, but also the kind of non-cognitive information that we got from students through their high school counselors, through their teachers. There is just so much nuance in a college admissions process, and so many things that are not statistical in nature. Obviously, we looked very heavily at their writing, and some people might say, well, they might have gotten some coaching during the writing, but there are lots of different ways where you can tell, especially in short answers, whether or not a student is really prepared for college level writing as well. So there are lots of different ways to do it. But again, I sometimes get a little frustrated that the argument for keeping the exam is that it standardizes and levels the playing field. And the reality is, given where we are in our country, that's not the case.
So we're always going to talk about alternatives in this world. And one that's frequently raised is AP scores or AP curricula. And I'm curious what you all think about the role of AP. AP is interesting because there's tests associated with it that are curriculum based. This is a curriculum that is offered at a high school, not an independent testing center. But Rebecca Zwick has made the comment that just about any kind of measure that we have of college readiness is correlated with SES, is correlated with income and wealth, and that we can't get away from that. And yet the AP stands here as a potential winner in a test optional world. So let me start with you, Jesse. What are your thoughts about AP in particular as a remedy for getting rid of tests as another indicator? Or do we have to think beyond things like AP and those kinds of academic measures?
Right. So I think the point that was made earlier is that we're not going to fix all of the sources of inequity in our education system with admissions. It's a very small piece of the puzzle. Ultimately, we have to fix access to educational opportunity K through 12. And we're kind of working around the edges if we're looking at admissions within our existing system. But I think it's true, any measure that we would use that measures preparedness is going to be correlated with family background. but they're not all equally correlated. And the SAT does look like it's worse than high school grades in particular. And so we can do grades-based admissions. We can put more weight on grades, and that looks like that is successful. So just as one example, a number of states, California among them, have implemented policies where at the public universities, they admit in some part based on the class rank of the student. So where the student is within their high school, without paying any attention at all to SAT scores. And those policies look like they work to identify students who can succeed, that can be successful. So the AP test in particular, I don't think we have great evidence on that. I think there are reasons to think that that creates inequities also, because under-resourced high schools can't offer as many AP courses. But at Berkeley, what we do is we look at how many AP courses you took relative to what's offered at your high school as a way of trying to adjust for that. And I think that goes some way in that direction. Ultimately, though, I think we have other measures. We have SATs, we have GPAs. We can use those, and they can bear the weight. Sarah's been raising her hand.
Sarah.
Just a thought here. So Jesse jumped in at the last minute with this. Again, the uneven distribution of AP offerings across high schools presses against using that as a substitute, and I think that maybe there's some future world in which technology may serve as an equalizer here, but we're not there yet on that front. And Jesse, high school grades actually introduce a challenge across the spectrum of selective and non-selective institutions. My review of the evidence suggests that they tend to be much more predictive outside the absolutely most selective institutions. At UVA, many of the top 20 institutions, you'll find that 90% of admitted students are from the top decile of their class ranks. So there just isn't a whole lot of predictive power from high school grades at those institutions. At the same time, again, we need multiple measures rather than just one weight. And I think we get maybe perhaps a little fixated on just the admissions margin here, where a big issue for selective colleges and universities is getting placement right in first-year courses so that talented students who may not have been gifted with high-resource high schools don't find themselves in over their heads in the first 2 weeks of classes just simply because they lack study skills or just modest elements of preparation. So you find out that you have a bad experience on your first multivariate calc midterm, and all of a sudden you're off the quantitative social sciences track, which is disappointing for everyone and a loss. So again, how do you use some form of assessments in placement, just not admissions, is a real issue that we need to grapple with and move the conversation about standardized measures maybe a little bit away from just the admissions margin.
Thank you, Sarah. So we're transitioning to questions from the audience. And we have a question here that speaks to this issue of alternative parts of the college application. So if essays become more important for the admissions process, how aware are college of the practice that high-income families are paying for editors to almost fundamentally write the essays for applicants? So essentially the question here is about the equity concerns if we shift more emphasis to essays. And I want to go to Anna, I want to go to you first with your experience, especially in advising students on how to write these essays.
Yeah, sure. So, of course, as we've been discussing, the whole process certainly advantages those students that have a lot of resource. But we have seen in our applications, of course, we receive primarily applications from students who are from low-income backgrounds. We certainly feel that the essays are tremendously valuable in evaluating students' readiness. And it's both how they write, but also what they're writing about. I mean, it's the actual story that is also sometimes tremendously compelling, even though the English or the exact elegance of the word or the sentence is maybe not as polished. Sometimes that actually makes a more compelling essay when it's not so shiny and polished. And so, and I certainly, our colleagues at the schools that we work with often feel that, and I believe them, that they can kind of tell a lot of times when it feels like a very produced essay, where it feels just a little too sleek, perhaps. I think what we really want to see, and what everybody in this work wants to see, is the true student, the real essence of her or him, and we really want to know not just how they express themselves in the written form, but also what they have to say, who they are through that story. And so, so it seems to me, I mean, to the question that that the audience member is asking, I think it's a valid question, a very important one, but I think there are thankfully ways to discern, and experienced readers often can discern, whether an essay feels authentic and when it doesn't. I know it's not a perfect system by any stretch, but thankfully I think that, there's a little of the nuances can be captured by experienced readers. I'd love to hear what the other panelists have to say on that one, though.
Someone like to chime in? Angel?
Love to hear what you have to say.
I'm happy to jump in, and I don't know if you saw me smiling, but I was smiling because I was getting texts from several admissions officers who are on this panel at highly selective institutions who said, jump in there and tell them, of course I can tell. And I will definitely echo those sentiments as someone who did that work for a long time. The reality of the matter is, admission officers can tell when a 45-year-old wrote the essay. And I will tell you that it's extremely refreshing, just like Anna said, to read an authentic essay, grammatically correct, of course, but an authentic essay that just sounds like a 17-year-old wrote it. And so, admission officers are pros at this. They spend their entire career right now. They're in the thick of it. They are reading thousands and thousands of applications. And there's a way to also really sort of figure some things out. Like there are parts, for example, if you're an institution that uses the Common Application, sometimes institutions ask for short answer questions. And there are times when your essay is so polished and beautifully written and uses words that only academics use. And then you go to the short answer and it's written like the 16-year-old. And so that essay was either polished or perhaps not even written. And that's always cause for a pause. So absolutely, they can tell.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of holistic admissions, this is based on another question from the audience. When you have GPAs or test scores, particularly with test scores, they're relatively transparent. You can look up the test form, how they're scored, that kind of thing. But when the admissions file has qualitative components like essays, like letters of recommendation, the critique is that the evaluation of those are more opaque. The admission processes are more opaque. And so do you think it's even more crucial now for colleges to be even more transparent, about their admissions criteria, especially with the inequity issues that we see, not just with things like the SAT, but also with regard to perhaps these qualitative components?
In my view, colleges need to be transparent about what their criteria are, about what they're looking for, and they need to communicate clearly what they're looking for. You're never going to be able to communicate exactly this is the set of criteria, and if you meet these, you will get in, and if you don't, you won't, and so you can predict it ahead of time. That was never the case at Stanford before, when it was using SATs, that you would be able to audit the process and understand why somebody did or didn't get in. It's always been a subjective decision, and it will be. I think the best you can do is communicate what the criteria are.
The only thing I would add is, because I agree with Jesse, the institution should be transparent and really letting the public know what's important in the process and what are the things they consider and what are the things they don't. Something that I'm seeing that's actually really inspiring me in the sense of moving towards equity is that high schools are being much more transparent about what they can and cannot do. There are high schools now where the high school counselor caseload, for example, in Arizona, the high school counselor to student ratio is 1 counselor to over 900 students. There is no way that in those high school counselors can write a thoughtful recommendation letter for each student in their caseload. So there are schools across the country now that are just saying, we just can't do it. We cannot write letters and we're not going to send you a form. And so please do not penalize our students for this. And colleges and universities, particularly highly selective institutions that have the resource and the number of admission staff that really can take the time to review every application thoughtfully, they're really working with those schools to make sure that, you know, they're not penalizing the counselors, or they're not penalizing the students because they don't have that particular information. So what I'm really sort of inspired by is some of this transparency is going both ways. And college admission officers really do see high school counselors as partners in the work. So the more communication we can have, the more transparency there can be around the requirements, but also on the high school side, high schools telling us what they can and cannot deliver to colleges.
Sarah, I thought you motioned.
Oh, just quickly, I saw a question in the chat that I thought I would throw up here, and maybe Angel or Anna will respond. But we think about the essays that are put forward. There's both the what's your favorite word and why, what do you hope to find at the end of the rainbow, you know, what would you paint on Beta Bridge, things like that. And, you know, I think there's this great, you know, I think that they're looking for more than writing skills, hopefully a sense of creativity. But someone asked, is there a way to also identify young people who have analytic problem solving skills in other ways? So at one point, one of my dissertation advisors said we should skip the essay and instead ask people to write down a model for the optimal strategy for applying to colleges. It was sort of in jest, but it's actually an interesting question. Are there ways to introduce into the, if you will, the free, the short answer, or the free form part of the application process, evaluative mechanisms that aren't just writing skills, but may tap on other parts of the university curriculum?
I think that sounds super exciting. I love that idea. I think there must be, you know, I don't exactly have an answer to the question, but it seems to me that's one of the exciting challenges for our, you know, our work to try to figure out, if we are unsatisfied with the current assessments now, what are the other ways that we can leverage the full application process to really capture rigorous thinking, critical thinking, problem solving. And I would also add to that kind of resourcefulness, things that actually we've seen our students, those who have them, even if they may not have had, you know, like exactly every advanced math course in high school, that once they get to the college, they look for the resources, they find, you know, the what they need to become successful, and then they become very successful. So I feel like there are qualities even beyond just the actual academic ones that lead to success and thriving in a university setting and ultimately in life. So I think that is one of the things that we as a body of people who care about this topic should be brainstorming and thinking about much more creatively than we've done in the past.
I also agree with Anna. I think it's incredibly exciting. And I just wanted to mention, in case any of you want to do research, there are some groups that are already really trying to dip their toes in the water and think a little bit differently. I'm on the advisory board of a group called the Mastery Transcript. So if you go to masterytranscript.org, you will see that it's a group of not only colleges and universities, but also high schools that are rethinking the high school transcript, and being able to deliver information to colleges about students, for example, about other kinds of skill sets that they bring to the table. So for example, global mindedness, or creativity and innovation, things that they actually prove in the classroom that don't necessarily translate into a transcript. So stay tuned there, because I think there's going to be some interesting things that come out of that movement. There's the Making Caring Common movement coming out of Harvard University, and they're really interested in ethical character and ethical behavior of students and how that translates into college success. And so that's something that I've been watching very closely. And then there's an organization called the Character Collaborative, and they're also looking at characteristics that students already have, things like grit and perseverance and being comfortable in a minority of one, innovation, creativity, that might actually predict success in college as well. And so those are just 3 organizations that I'm currently aware of that are starting to rethink the model a little bit, which I find very exciting.
So this might be a cynical view, but I think we can, or colleges and universities can come up with quote unquote better ways to define and perhaps measure college readiness, and they can be transparent about them. They could say, we are looking for students with character, and character can be expressed this way and that way. And the cynical view is that there will always be a way to game that. Right, so we're already doing that with essays, with the ways that students might be gathering letters of recommendation or preparing for interviews. Is that an inherent problem here? Is it an insurmountable problem? Are there safeguards to make college admissions, perhaps in this test optional or test blind regime, more equitable?
We'll just submit Campbell's Law. Jesse's probably going for it too, which is again, when we think about performance evaluation of teachers in any evaluative context, if you put all of the weight on one measure, you're going to increase the incentives to gain that measure, where if you have a portfolio of measures, it's going to be hard for someone to game all of them. That doesn't take away the obvious advantages of resources, which help with all pieces of this, but it again reduces some of the strategic behavior. Others may have more profound thoughts.
So I absolutely agree with the Campbell's Law point, and I would add to that the Jonathan Swift point, or a modest proposal, which is there is just no way we are going to avoid gaming if this many people want to get into these schools and they're this hard to get into, and it's seen as important as it is. It's going to happen. My modest proposal is that we should take some of the most elite schools seriously on something they often say, which is that they have 10 times as many qualified applicants as they could admit. They should actually identify 3 times as many as they could admit, or 5 times as many as they could admit, and then randomly choose among them, and send a clear signal to families that there is nothing you can do that will guarantee you admission, because I don't think anything else is going to get rid of the arms race that we have.
Anna or Angel? When you advise students, part of your job in some ways is to help them learn the system and work through it.
Yeah, Anthony, I tend to be an optimist, but in this particular case, I'm not, because I agree with Jesse. I think if there is a system, it's going to be broken in some way, and there will be disadvantages. I also would remind our audience that, college admissions preparation is a $1 billion+ industry, and so is testing. And so if testing goes away, my prediction is that that kind of energy will move towards preparing students in another way, right? I mean, it's already there around college essay prep and things like that. So I do believe that that industry will continue. I do think a lot of the onus will be on colleges and universities, again, to be transparent, but also to really try as much as they can to evaluate every application in context, and to make sure that they take a student's background so that those that are disadvantaged still have the opportunity to have a place at the table.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just add that I agree that, gaming is going to happen, but I do also know that one's life experience is what it is. And I think in our case and in our experience at QuestBridge, the students, and I know that this is a particularly compelling group of students, but when they tell their story, when they share the truth of who they are compelling candidates. Now, it could be that there are too many for the seats available, and that's a big problem that we need to solve as well as a society. But I think what I'm saying is perhaps it's what we're asking, how we're asking it, that can potentially help to enable those who are truly amazing, compelling applicants to be able to be more visible, and have more access to these institutions. I think one of the things we have been trying to do at QuestBridge all along was to design our application so that the qualities that these students have that may not have otherwise be captured in the sort of traditional setting can come through. So it's possible that there are ways that we can, as again, a group of people who care about this, to really look at how we're asking the students to present themselves in such a way that maybe can lead to a little bit more of an equitable distribution across the population. That's just a thought I have, but and I hope that that's true. But we all hope that we will see more equity as we move forward.
Well, I'm going to have to close the Q&A part of our event tonight, but I want to sort of close on a hopeful note. I'm really heartened. First, thank you, each of you. Thank our panelists for their thoughts, but more so for the work. And I'm very heartened by the work that each of you do in college access. College access is not a perfect system by any means. There are lots of inequities that reside within it, but all of you are working in your various parts of our industries to remedy that to the best way that we can. And, I'm sure everyone on this event sees very motivated and smart people working this problem. And I'm heartened by that. So thank you all for that. I'm going to pass it now to Sonia, who will take us out.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you all so much for being here, for your questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of them, and just want to reiterate thanks to all of our panelists, including Anthony, for your candor and for your insights today. In the meantime, please, everyone, stay safe, take care, and I hope to see you again at another kind of event like this in the future. Good night, everyone.